Hello everyone! The call of the Scarab micro-holiday is upon us once again. After a year of your faction being represented in Silithus, it's time to once again honor the call and fight for the right to fly your banner at Ahn'Qiraj. But what exactly is the story behind all of this? That's what we're going to be talking about today. It all begins way back when, at the moment where the Titans found a little planet called Azeroth with a slumbering Titan spirit inside. The world was corrupted with the malevolent evil of the old gods, but the Titans, with the use of their keepers, they were able to contain the threats and give Azeroth a fighting chance. In the land, later known as Silithus, they housed the old god K'Fun in a subterranean prison, which was later expanded on by Khep'Ra and his Titan Force followers. The Anubisoft giants and the Leonine Tol'Vir labored day and night until they constructed the mighty fortress that we now know as Ahn'Qiraj. Khep'Ra then ordered his followers to safeguard the stronghold, as he himself would spend the following ages roaming the southern regions of Azeroth. During the battles with the old gods, the keepers had to also deal with their forces. Amongst them were the Ahn'Qir, insectoids of incredible resilience and strength. They were born from organic matter that seeped from the old gods' blighted forms, while in time the keepers destroyed most of the Ahn'Qiri race. Small pockets of the insectoids, those that had tunneled deep underground, they escaped the keepers' wrath. Many years later, trolls would foolishly perform vile rituals and living sacrifices to awaken the Kha'Thrax, a mighty faceless one also born from the old gods' organic matter. This faceless one was known as Kha'Thix. They succeeded, and the Kha'Thrax woke up. He looked upon the troll civilization with nothing but contempt, for it was but a pale shadow of what the Black Empire, the empire of the old gods ruling the world before the Titans showed up, once was. Kha'Thix knew it would delight the old gods to see this puny civilization rent to ashes, and he found a race of creatures to aid him with this task, the Ahn'Qir, which it could control. The swarms were rallied, driving them to make war and establish their dominance over Azeroth once again. As Kha'Thix took its time to expand its power and recover, the Ahn'Qir began building a vast subterranean empire known as Ahn'Qir. He patiently watched and waited as the Ahn'Qiri ranks rose in number. When the time was right, the Kha'Thrax led the insectoids from the underground empire, and they swept across the land. At first, the trolls were overwhelmed by this force. Something like this they had never faced before, but soon enough, the Zandalari took charge and the trolls pushed back. The Drakari, they pushed into the frigid north near Ulduar. The Amani set their eyes on defeating Kha'Thix, building their new settlement of Zul'Aman on the spot where they defeated the Kha'Thrax. While the Gurubashi, they decided to go southwest, where the Ahn'Qir had overrun Ahn'Qiraj. The Titan forts left inside were corrupted, enslaved by the insectoids, and early engagements between the Gurubashi and the Ahn'Qir, they proved disastrous for the trolls. The insectoids and their mighty Anubisoft slaughtered several large Gurubashi encampments. Thereafter, the Zandalari instructed Gurubashi priests to separate the tribe into smaller, more mobile raiding groups instead of large armies. This new tactic, it allowed them to constantly harass the Ahn'Qir, bleeding the insectoid armies dry over a period of many years. Though they were never able to completely wipe out the Ahn'Qir, the Gurubashi eventually won uncontested control of the surrounding territory. With their leader, with the Kha'Thrax gone, the rest of the Ahn'Qir, they no longer fought with as much ferocity or purpose. After many centuries of brutal battles between trolls and the insectoids, the trolls were able to shatter the Ahn'Qir empire. The remaining insectoids, they were contained to the far northern and southern reaches of the continent. Those that survived fortified the underground colonies against further troll attacks. They showed no more interest in fighting, and in time, the trolls proclaimed themselves victorious. But their victory, it did not mean the end of the Ahn'Qir. Under the influence of the old gods nearby, change started to happen, and three distinct cultures would arise from the Ahn'Qir empire. The insectoids in the north, they gathered near the underground prison of Yogg-Saron. Due to their proximity to the old god, these Ahn'Qir would gradually evolve into a race called the Nerubians. The Ahn'Qir in the southeast, they congregated where Y'Shaaraj's essence still polluted the land. These insectoids would eventually transform into a race called the Mantids. Now the Ahn'Qir in the southwest, they made their home in Ahn'Qiraj, where K'Fun's foul presence would slowly warp the Ahn'Qir's form over time, molding them into a race known as the Qiraji. Since their defeat against the Troll Empire, the descendants of the Ahn'Qiri had stayed hidden in their subterranean domains. Only the Mantid of Pandaria, they remained an active threat, and nearly all of Azeroth races had all but forgotten the ruthless potential of the insectoid colonies that lurked beneath the earth. Within Ahn'Qiraj's lifeless sandstone corridors, the insectoids lay dormant. Even when Azshara made contact with Sargeras, they tried to summon the Legion into the world, which ultimately resulted in the sundering of the land. Though Azshara and her Night Elf Empire had once upon a time known of the fortress, its existence had become all but lost to time. Ahn'Qiraj wouldn't be rediscovered by the elves until Archdruid Fendrel Stackhelm 975 years before the Dark Portal opened up. And to keep that in perspective, it was around 10,000 years ago when Azshara made contact with Sargeras. So 975 years before the Dark Portal opened up, they came up with a brilliant idea to regrow the land of Silithus. Fendrel sent out his warrior son Volstan and a group of his most trusted druids to perform this task. They trudged across the scalding dunes, searching for hidden water reservoirs that they could use to transform the region into a lush forest. Volstan and his comrades eventually stumbled across Ahn'Qiraj. Although some of the druids cautioned against entering the fortress, Volstan did it anyways. His presence in the cold dead halls inadvertently rose the dormant Qiraji back to life. From its prison beneath Ahn'Qiraj, Kafun also became aware of the awakened Qiraji. The old god drove the insectoids into a murderous frenzy. The highest classes of the Qiraji society, they began organizing their lesser minions, the most numerous of which were known as the Silithus. These vicious insectoids, they came in many forms, and all of them obeyed the will of their Qiraji overlords. The discovery of the Qiraji, it shocked Volstan and his druid companions. Upon retreating from Ahn'Qiraj, they established a small outpost in Silithus to keep watch over the insectoids. Before their eyes, the fortress swelled with greater and greater numbers of Qiraji. Then, without warning, a massive army spilled forth from the tunnels beneath Ahn'Qiraj. At the head of this swarming host were the Qiraji. They directed their Silithid minions to engulf the surrounding deserts and spread into the other regions as well. By this time, Volstan very wisely had called for help from his father. Fendrel rallied a force of druids, sentinels, priestess and keepers of the grove to deal with the Qiraji threats. In the southern reaches of Kalimdor, the Night Elf hosts clashed with their vicious foes. At times, they managed to drive the Qiraji back towards the dunes of Silithus, only for the insectoids to mount a counterattack and regain the advantage. This ebb and flow continued for many months, leaving in its wake the broken corpses of elves and insectoids alike. Fendrel and his comrades, they established outposts across southern Kalimdor. From these locations, they continued a brutal fight against the Qiraji. Eventually, the tireless druids and their allies, they managed to push the Qiraji back into the heart of Silithus itself. Yet, just as victory seemed within reach, the war took a dire turn. News had reached them that the town of Southwind village was under attack. Now Fendrel, he considered pulling his troops back to defend his village, but he sensed that such an action would only leave an open door to invasion from the remaining Qiraji. They still had no idea of just how many the insects numbered, or even if they'd seen all that this new race had to throw at them. It was Volstan who offered to lead a detachment to this village so that Fendrel could stay behind and provide containment. The thought of all of this being a ruse, it had crossed their minds, but they simply couldn't take the chance. The village had to be defended, and Volstan promised his father that he would remain victorious, upholding the honor of his name. Reluctantly, Fendrel nodded. "Just return alive, and I will be more than satisfied." For the next few days, they battled wave after wave of Silithid streaming from the hives scattered throughout the land. On the third day, the Qiraji appeared, their numbers reinforced. Once again, the buzz of insect wings stirred within the air. They spread about before Fendrel and the others, like the shadow caused by a giant cloud obscuring the sun, and then they simply stopped and waited. Fendrel formed his lines and stood at the forefront as the oceans of insects parted and the hulking form of the Qiraji general approached. He carried a wounded figure in its clawed appendage. It proceeded to the front of the Qiraji lines and held Volstan Stackhelm aloft for all to see. Gauze spread throughout the ranks. Fendrel simply stood mute, knowing that Southwind had fallen and fearing that his son may already be dead. He cursed himself for allowing the boy to leave, and he stood frozen by a mixture of fear, anger, and despair. Within the general's claw, Volstan stirred, and he spoke to the general, though he was too far away to be heard. At once, the spell that had fallen over Fendrel broke, and he bolted forward, followed by the Night Elf forces, but the distance was great. The Qiraji general fixed his second claw onto Volstan's bloodied form, and with both, he squeezed and pulled apart, separating the young Night Elf's body at the waists. Volstan's death, it shattered the Archdruid and sowed uncertainty throughout the Night Elf's ranks. The Qiraji seized the opportunity, and they swarmed out of Silithus once again, pushing into the eastern deserts of Teneris. They even dared to assault the sanctum of the Bronze Dragonflight, the Caverns of Time, which in turn pushed the Bronze Dragonflight into action. Led by Ahn'Qiraj, they enlisted the help of Kelastras, child of Alexstrasza from the Red Dragonflight, Marifra, child of Ysera of the Green, and Aragos, child of Malagos from the Blue. The mighty dragons joined the Night Elves' host and helped drive the Karaji armies back behind the walls of Ahn'Qiraj. But even with the mighty dragons joining the war, there were simply too many Karaji to vanquish entirely, not to mention that the old god Kafun was still empowering their forces. Vendrell feared that the war would never end. Thousands of elves had already perished at the claws of the insectoids, and he was loath to sacrifice more of his people. Ultimately, he and the dragons came up with a plan to lock the insectoids within Ahn'Qiraj itself. Vendrell called on his druids to focus their powers as one. Along with Ahn'Qiraj, the elves summons a great barricade to close off Ahn'Qiraj. Marifra, Kalastras and Eragos, they sacrificed themselves by pushing into the city and holding off the Karaji long enough for the rest of the forces to create the magical barrier. Outside the cursed city, the dry earth split wide, and a magical barrier of stone and colossal roots emerged. This impenetrable scarab wall towered high over the barren landscape, effectively sealing the Karaji within their city forever. As a final act, Ahn'Qiraj forged 2 mystical artifacts. He motioned to a scarab scuttling below his feet. The creature froze, then flattened out, transforming into a metallic gong. Stone shifted into place near the wall, creating a dais where the scarab gong was finally placed. The great dragon then proceeded to the severed limb of one of his fallen companions. He held the appendage, and after a series of incantations, the limb morphed into the shape of a scepter, the Scepter of the Shifting Sands. Handing the scepter to the Archdruid, the dragon told Vendrell that should any mortal ever wish to pass the magical barrier and access the ancient city, they need only to strike the scepter against the gong and the gates would open. Vendrell looked down, his face twisted in contempt. I want nothing to do with Silithus, the Karaji, and least of all any damn dragons. With that, Vendrell swung the enchanted object into the magical gates, where it splintered in a shout of fragments, and he walked away. Vendrell found no solace in ending the Karaji threats, for Valstan's death still tormented his heart. The pieces of the Scepter of the Shifting Sands, they became lost for the next 1,000 years, but the need to re-enter the city, that would arise during classic World of Warcraft, as the old god Kafun, he incited the Karaji to frenzy, and both the Alliance and Horde prepared for a massive war effort to preemptively deal with this threat. To do so, they had to breach the Scarab Wall, which meant reforging the Scepter, while also funding the war effort by bringing a whole bunch of resources together. We're talking about ore, fish, leather, herbs, bandages. Wars ain't cheap, and the amount was quite absurd, but then again, this was a server-wide cross-faction effort, which took months to complete. In the meantime, someone had to go through the incredibly long, and when I say long, I mean long questline to get the Scepter reforged, which is unfortunately no longer available in-game. It all began with getting a reputation to neutral with the Brood of Nosdormu faction. Pedestal of the Shifting Sands in Cenarian Hold, he was turned into a watcher by the Bronze Dragonflight, and he offers the chance to prove our worth. First, we check if his master Ahn'Qiraj has returned at the Caverns of Time, which confirms to him that it is as it should be. The Great One has risen, and there's no time to waste. A hero must be found, and this might be us, if we're able to slay Broodlord Lashlayer and return with his head. Only then can we begin the reputation grind by slaying Silithus at Hive Ashi, Hive Zora and Hive Regal. They drop carapace fragments. 200 can be repeatedly turned in at Pedestal to increase the reputation. Or, if the gates have already been opened up, you can also get reputation from killing the bosses inside of Ahn'Qiraj. Upon finally reaching neutral, we become worthy to talk with his master, while he's also kind enough to give us a tome, which tells us the tale of the War of the Shifting Sands. Its contents no longer fully lines up with the story that we know from the Chronicles and the short story, but the essence is still the same. An essence also shown after checking out a single crystalline tear near the sacred barrier, as a vision of the past shows us the dragons sacrificing themselves. The wall is created, and Falstad shatters the scepter. After learning about the past, we return to Ahn'Qiraj, who lets us know that, of course, he gathered the shattered pieces of the scepter, and he returned them to the Caverns of Time. He had every intention of protecting it from those that would seek to use it to cause harm to our worlds. Thus was born the Charge of the Dragonflights, a scepter divided amongst the 4 mighty aspects that will prove to be nearly impossible to restore for those willfully seeking chaos, or at least that's what he thought. Time has not been kind to the Dragonflights, whether by agents of the old gods or betrayal by those that would call them friends. Each guardian of a piece of the scepter has fallen to tragedy. We need to seek them out and prepare ourselves for the worst. Ahn'Qiraj still holds his piece, and no shard will be given to the corrupted black Dragonflights, which means that our quest aims at the red, green, and the blue Dragonflights. The red one is the simplest of the 3, but by no means is it easy. Heroes had to venture into Blackwing Lair and talk with Vilastras the Corrupt, the second boss of the raid. He actually came here in an attempt to kill Nefarian, but the Black Dragon proved to be more powerful, and he corrupts the red, turning him against us.
Now he shall serve me by slaughtering you. Get up, little red worm, and destroy them.
It is in his darkest hour that one should rise to relieve him of the shards, but sadly, Nefarian has taken it from him and he plans to destroy it. This means that the raid only had 5 hours to complete the entire raid, slay Nefarian and take the red scepter shard of his corpse before he destroys it. Like I said, simple enough, but not easy to do. Now the green one that had heroes travel to the temple of Ahn'Qiraj, also known as the Sunken Temple, to find the shade of Ahn'Qiraj. After Ysera, the green dragon aspect smashed the temple to stop the Atalai's plan to summon Hakkar the Soul Flayer. Ahn'Qiraj and a few others, they were sent in to deal with the remaining Atalai priest and stop their plans. Inside, they were somewhat successful, yet still fell to the corruption of the Emerald Nightmare. Now you might remember dealing with the Nightmare during Legion. That was like the second coming of the Nightmare. This was before all of that played out, so something had to be done about Ahn'Qiraj's corruption before we could retrieve the shards. The image of Malfurion, he sends us to Darnassus to inform Tyrande, which then sends us to the Moonglade to talk with Keeper Remulus. He in turn then sends us to the 4 dream portals over Azeroth, located in Ashenvale, Duskwood, Feralis and the Hinterlands. From the Dragonkin nearby these portals, we were able to farm a fragment of the Nightmare's corruption, while the one in Duskwood had us fight a 40-man raid satyr known as the Twilight Corruptor. With these 4 fragments gathered, we lured Ahn'Qiraj out, and of course we had to show restraint. The green dragon was not inherently evil, he was corrupted by the Nightmare, and with the blessing of Elune, called upon by Tyrande, we were able to cleanse the green dragon. In gratitude, he offered his green shard, while returning to the dream to aid his beloved Ysera in the war against the Nightmare. Then, the final shard that we need, the blue one, that quest line was just insanely long. This shard was held by the blue dragon Azuragos, a world boss during Classic World of Warcraft, but you could talk to him either living or in his spirit form. The blue didn't really care about guarding the shard for very long. He knew that it would only give him trouble, while all he wants is to be left alone to his studies, and not babysit some would-be hero's ticket to glory. So it was that he came up with the brilliant plan to give it to a fish, but not any kind of fish, a very special minnow, which he granted some very special powers. Now the waters of the sea, they're vast, and they contain many minnows, but not to worry, to draw out this special fishy, we had to create an Arcanite buoy. His minnow would then be attracted to the magical emanations. When he gets near the buoy, blammo! It will expose in a glorious pulse of arcane energy, revealing the minnow's true form. We also may or may not incur the wrath of Neptulon the Tidehunter, but hey, what's life without a little bit of risk? The blue dragon is even kind enough to give us the schematics for it. Schematics brought over to the gnome Narian Fancy, but he can't read it since it's written in Draconic. We need to figure out what Azuragos has written down, which requires his scrying goggles, a 500-pound chicken, and volume 2 of Draconic for Dummies. The scrying goggles, they were taken by his ex-best friend for life, or as Stuvel would call it, slave for life, who we tracked down, but unfortunately he lost the goggles while going through the Molten Core, so we kill minions inside the raids until it drops. The 500-pound chicken, that's cooked up by Dirge Quickcleave after killing Lord Legmarin on the Isle of Dread and gathering some chimeric tenderloins, deep rock salt and rocket fuel. The Draconic for Dummies, that was hidden away by the gnome on an island so far out that we can't actually reach it without dying from fatigue. Thankfully, Meredith the Mermaiden is there to help us out. She's quite taken by the gnome, and she wants us to deliver a love letter to him. Now he's not really interested, you know, a gnome and a fish, that would never work out. But she is kind enough to thereafter give us a swimming speed buff, which allows us to reach the island, only to discover that the book has been stolen by none other than Narian's arch-enemy, Dr. Weevil. We try to outsmart him, but this backfires and the good doctor destroys the book. The only known copy of it was ripped into 8 parts and scattered to the wind. One is taken from the body of Dr. Weevil. One is dropped from demons in the Blasted Lands, one from demons in Winterspring, one is found in the Undercity, one in the Stormwind Keep Library, one on the body of Onyxia, one in Blackwing Lair, and finally, one dropped of Ragnaros the Firelords. After all that, we're still not quite done yet. To actually make the damn thing, Narain needs 20 Arcanite bars, 10 Elementium Ignats, 10 Blue Sapphires, and 10 Azerothian Diamonds. Those, let me tell you, were not cheap back in the day, but all of that combined, it does give us what we need. Off the coast of Azora, we spawned Moss, the minnow carrying the shard, and finally, with all 4 combined, we can reforge the scepter of the Shifting Sands. Now all we need to do is wait for the war effort to complete, for the Horde and Alliance to gather enough resources, and after 5 days of transporting the troops, we can finally bang the Scarab gong, tear down the wall, and start the 10-hour war server event.
You are already dead.
A global message was spread. Champion of the Bronze Dragonflight has rung the Scarab gong. The ancient gates of Ahn'Qiraj open, revealing the horrors of a forgotten war. Like the days of old, we had to face against General Rajak and all of his powerful minions. We even ventured into the Titan facility itself, and we took on not just the Silithus and the Karaji, but even the manifestation of the old god Kafun himself. The 3 dragons that sacrificed themselves, they've spent all the time locked up inside, but we're able to set them free and even score some sexy gear. Now you might wonder, what exactly do we reward those that have been able to forge the scepter? Well, those that rang the gong first, or even within the 10 hours of the first one, you'll be rewarded with a unique black Karaji battle tank. Although many varieties of Karaji battle tanks can still be found in the ruins of Ahn'Qiraj today, the darkest of the species were only seen on the day that the Scarab gong was rung. The Scarab lore title that will forever mark those crazy enough to fuse the scepter, which in the short story is done by the Night Elf priestess Shiromar, a veteran of the War of the Shifting Sands, while the first player to do this was named Galahad on the US server of Medivh, who rang the gong in January of 2006. This is why we celebrate and remember the call of the Scarab, where 12 years ago a bloody war was triggered by a simple sound. No rallying fanfare, no bloodthirsty yell, just an eerie silence, and many, many realms that simply crashed because they couldn't handle that many people in one single zone. Today though, we celebrate the heroics of those past adventurers by returning to Silithus and walking in their footsteps. What's more, this is a competition between the Horde and Alliance. Whichever group can earn more credits earns the right to fly their flag next to the gong for the rest of the year. Earning credits, that can be done by world quests, turning in resources, taking on the forces of the Karaji and the Twilight's Hammer. Faction Pride, that is going to be our reward, but some data mine information, it reveals that the new models we've seen used in Silithus, they're also going to be applied to temporary mounts available during this micro holiday. Surprisingly, they also decided to give those that already had the Black Karaji battle tank, they got an updated new version on top of the one that they already possessed. That means that those few lucky enough to be around during Classic, and those that used that small window of opportunity due to a bug, I believe that was during Wrath of the Lich King, they now get a shinier, brighter model. This has been received with mixed responses. Now I personally don't really care. I didn't have the mount to begin with, I already have like 300 mounts that I don't use, so I don't really care if they give an updated one to those that already had it. I doubt it took them a whole lot of resources to recolor the temporary mounts and make it permanent, but I do wonder why exactly they did this. It doesn't affect a whole bunch of players, since it's no longer obtainable, and the response, like I said, some feel like they're missing out just because they didn't play back in those days. Will they now also add new models to other mounts that are no longer obtainable? I don't see the massive benefit to it, considering that it rewards such a small group, but again, to me, I don't really care. I was talking with Pakulia about this from wowhead.com, and she came up with a suggestion that perhaps, and this is just a tinfoil moment, perhaps in the future they could add like a time-walking opening of a queue event, which would reopen the whole Forging of the Scepter questline and give players another chance at this mount. If they're going to do that, I'm going to be all over that. The research for this video, it was difficult, considering that a whole lot of things have been removed by now, but it was also really fun to do, and I would love to experience this questline for myself. Despite playing back then, I wasn't crazy enough to go through all of this. My part was just turning in resources and completely missing out on the opening of the gates, because I either couldn't log in with the whole servers overloaded, or I was out for a job interview. I don't really remember. Either way, this is all the story that I have for you when it comes to the background for this micro holiday. From bringing order to Azeroth and imprisoning Kafun within Ahn'Qiraj, to the Horde and Alliance figuring out that evil was stirring once again, and the wall erected at the end of the War of the Shifting Sands that had to be brought down. I really hope you enjoyed it, everyone. As always, subscribe if you like my videos, leave a like if you enjoyed this one, and until next time guys, see ya!